Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snugglebug Stitching, and today we are looking at my Rella's Diamonds quilt. I just finished this one, just got it off the machine. This pattern is a pattern that I wrote specifically for this fabric line. I used all fabrics from binidng, and they are all from the same fabric line. That would be Gratitude and Grace by Pat Sloan. This pattern is free and it's available on binidng's site, and I will have the link for that in the description. So for this particular tutorial, we are looking at joining the ends of our binding. And when I first started quilting, binding was probably the thing that I found most stressful, specifically joining the ends of the binding. I felt like I never cut the two ends to the right length. I always ended up having the two ends twisted. It just caused a lot of frustration, and joining your ends with a diagonal seam is just really a little bit trickier. Now, I do have a tutorial already up for you where I joined the ends with the flat seam, so I will link that in the description. But for this video today, we're going to be using a diagonal seam. So let's look at these seams. This right here, get close so you can see it. This seam is the seam where I joined the ends. And the only reason that I know that this seam is the seam where I joined the ends is because it was the only seam that was close to another seam in the binding. So these two seams look the same. You can't tell by looking at the quilt which seam was the seam where I joined the ends together. And if you flip it over to the front, you can see that it looks nice on the front too, just like the other one. So since I found this to be the trickiest way to join the ends myself when I first started quilting, I've tried to come up with a way to do it that is easier. It does not require measuring, and it does not require it doesn't cause all this frustration where you wonder if you're going to sew them together the wrong way so that the binding is twisted. You have to pick the stitches out, do it again. So I've come up with a method that I think is a lot easier. It also, as you can see, makes for a nice seam that looks just like the other seams. So I did record everything when I was making this one, and I'll show you how I did this. Okay, so we're going to join these two ends of the binding with the diagonal seam. And when I first started quilting, that is something that I found really stressful. So I'm going to show you a way that's not so stressful to do this. So this end right here is the end where I started sewing the binding on, and you can see that the selvage is still on here. That's not going to make any difference because that's not going to show up in the quilt anyway. And I started sewing here about 10 inches or so down from the beginning of that binding piece. So that's just going to give us a little bit of leeway. And this is my other side. So what we're going to do to join these is we are going to, if you pressed this binding in half, you'll go ahead and open it up. And you're going to take one side of the binding. It does not matter which side of the binding you start with, but you're going to take one side of this binding, one end of this binding, and you're going to fold it up in a 90-degree angle. So you'll want the place where that binding folds over to make a 90-degree angle. And it does not matter which end of the binding you use, and it also doesn't matter whether you fold it out this way or whether you fold it back in on itself. So you're really just looking for whichever direction, whichever end, you just want it to match the direction that the seams from the rest of your binding are going in. So the way you would tell that, and I have a seam right here, and I'm going to go ahead and lay this pencil down. The seam is going in this direction. I'm going to lay this pencil down in that direction so that you can see that, and I'm going to show you what I mean. So the way you check to make sure that you're folding that the way that you want it to be is that you'll go ahead and fold that up and then fold it over like it would be in your binding, and you kind of make a little triangle right there, and we're going to mark that with this other pencil, and you see they're going in the same direction. So that's going to mean that this seam where you join the ends is going in the same direction as the other binding seams. Now, I'm not going to lie, if you accidentally have this going in the wrong direction, you know, it's really not that big of a deal. Worse things have happened when you're using, you know, depending on your binding, but with this dark binding I'm using, the seams are pretty hard to see anyway. So if you do end up with your seam from where you join the ends going in the opposite direction, don't worry about it. I definitely would not unpick the stitches for that. So now that I know which way I'm going to go, I'm going to fold this up, and we're going to make sure if you have your binding folded in half, you're going to open that up now, and we're going to line these side of the binding up with the edge of your quilt, and we're going to make it flat, but we're not going to stretch it. So we'll fold this over, and you want to make sure that you have this whole piece folded over. So something like that, where I can still see that binding and it's not folded completely over. Something like that would not work. You want to make sure that that whole piece is folded over. And before you do anything else, take the other end of your binding and stretch it out, and make sure that that other end of the binding is completely covering this little right angle that you made. So something like that, where you can see it's obviously not going over, it's not going to cut it. So just do that before you do anything else, just to make sure you have enough. So now that we have that folded over, you can use your iron or your fingers, whatever you want to do. We're going to make a hard crease, and we want close to a right angle between these two edges. So we're going to make a hard crease, and you're going to use that crease later as a guide for sewing so that you don't have to measure anything. So now that I have a good hard crease there, I'm going to grab some clips, and I'm just going to go ahead and clip these pieces just so that I can make sure that that stays laying nice and flat against there, so that this will fit nicely when we're done. So now we're going to grab some glue. This is just a washable glue stick. You can also use Elmer's washable glue stick. I do use the Disappearing Purple a lot. And we're going to put glue on this right sides of the fabric, this little triangle that the right sides of the fabric makes. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and put one more little clip here. And then I'm going to open up this side too. So if you fold it over, open it up. And you've got, just like with the other side, the right side of your binding up against that side of your quilt. And I'm going to use the clips here too, just to keep this pulled nice and flat, but not stretching it. And then we're going to just mash that down so that those two pieces are glued together. Okay. So once those two pieces are glued together, got some pins, I'm going to pick that up, and you may have gotten a little glue on the back of your quilt, that's fine. And then we're just going to kind of give us, you see this is stretched tight, so we don't have much leeway. We're going to give ourselves a little more leeway here, and I'm going to fold this quilt in on itself and just kind of grab the parts where my seam started, fold it in on itself, and we're going to use either a big clip or a clothespin, whatever you have. And then we're going to take these two ends that we glued together, and you can see where they're glued together. You can open that up, and there's a hard crease where you're going to sew. So right here you can see that hard crease. I'm just going to put a pin or two, however much you want to do, just to the sides of that little crease. And then I'm going to go over to my machine, and I'm going to sew right down that crease line. And then after I do that, I'll meet you back here and show you how it turned out. Okay, so I've got this one. I've sewn right down that crease line. I'm going to unclip it and lay this back out flat, and we will see how we did. All right, so before we cut anything apart, before we trim off the extra from that seam, let's just lay this out and see if it looks like it's right. So this is kind of one of the things that I always struggled with these kind of seams, is making sure that I put these two together the right way so that it would fold over nicely and that there was the right length. So let's just check. And we've got this folded over, and it's going the right direction, and it looks like our length is good. So we're going to take this and we're going to cut this extra off, and I'm just eyeballing it. I usually go about half an inch instead of a quarter. So now that that's cut off, we can go ahead and take this to the machine and finish sewing from the point where we started on this end to the point where we stopped on that end. And these little horns can be cut off later, but something that I like to do is go ahead and press this little seam here, and there's gonna be glue because we just glued that together, but I like to go ahead and press this little seam here open so that it'll be pressed open just like the other seams were, and there won't be any extra bulk at this seam where we join the binding, so that when your quilt is finished, you won't be able to tell which seam was the seam where we joined the ends and which were all the other seams. So, and sometimes I'll get some glue and kind of put a little glue here, glue that open, and glue this other side open. That just keeps it down. You can also take it to your iron and press, but now that that's pressed open, you just fold it over, take it to your sewing machine, and finish sewing that together. So I will meet you back here once it's done. Okay, so now that that's sewn together, this is where our binding, where I initially started sewing it on, over here is where I finished sewing it on. And you can see right here, that's that seam that we just made, and you can see that it looks nice. You won't be able to tell any difference between that seam and this seam right here. If I can find it. Oh, there we go. You can tell I need to pluck these threads, but this seam looks the same as this seam that we just made and fits nicely. And now we are ready to flip that binding over to the other side and sew it down. And these little horns right here from where we joined the seams on the diagonal, we'll cut those off as we're flipping that over. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it helped.